Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 8 of our coverage of the 2018 Candidates Tournament. We're halfway through the tournament so far. There are 14 rounds, and we've gone through 7, so we have 7 more to go, and that means that every player is going to be playing the same opponents they did in the first 7 rounds, but they will be flipping the sides. So today we have Alexander Grischuk playing the white pieces, going against Vladimir Kramnik, his fellow countryman. In the first match, round number 1, when they played, Vladimir Kramnik had the white pieces and was victorious. Currently, at this match, they have both seen Fabiano Caruana, who's leading the tournament, tie his game, one of the first games to draw on the day. And so they were able to be in their game knowing that if someone were to win their match, they would be only a point behind Fabiano with 6 games left in the Candidates Tournament, with the winner of the Candidates Tournament going on to play Magnus Carlsen in November for the World Championship. So this match means everything to both of these players, as it really separates them and gets them into that leader group going into the final 6 rounds of play. So we'll get started with Alexander. Starts out pawn c4, pawn e6, knight c3, pawn d5, pawn to d4, so getting into the queen's gambit line. A knight here to f6, a knight f3, pawn c5, all pretty common moves in the queen's gambit. Pawn to e3, and then the queen's gambit accepted line with pawn takes on c4. Don't always see black deciding to take the pawn here on c4, but that's exactly what Vladimir decides to do. Bishop takes back with c4. Pawn to a6, getting ready to push forward his pawn to b5. Brings the bishop back here to b3. Pawn here to b5, and then pawn up to e4. So we all of a sudden see Grischuk saying, I don't mind if you attack me on the queen side of the board. I'm going to go ahead and start pushing forward in the center of the board. After the pawn takes, the knight recaptures, and then bishop here to b7. Not really looking to exchange off the board, as white, could have always played queen to d4, but does have the advantage of going first, has more developed pieces. No reason right now to trade off your most powerful piece on the board. So bishop to b7, controlling the light squares, and then pawn up to e5, attacking the knight. Knight comes down here to e4, and then castle on the king side. And this is interesting because I feel like it's pretty easy for white to just take here on e4. Bishop takes on e4. That's fine. Castle on the king side. Yes, this is a very active bishop. It's not doing too much, not really attacking too much material or putting white in a bind by any means. Already developed most of his pieces. Going to get the dark square bishop out. This bishop's not stopping that at all. But instead, once white castles on the king side, then the knight can come here to c3. After the pawn recaptures, white has an isolated pawn. This is definitely something that white prepared for, so he's comfortable with this isolated pawn, but generally something I try to avoid. A lot of players will try to avoid as well, unless they have a very good reason doing so. So this was an option that he had, but decided to go and play with the isolated pawn. Knight comes down here to c6, and then pawn to a4. Now, if you look at pawn to a4, it may look pretty innocent, but it's actually a pretty tough move for black to have to calculate and figure out how he's going to continue. Let's look at a few options here. One would just be, well, let's take this pawn right here. We have to keep in mind, as we're looking at that, this pawn and this knight are both attacking this square here on b5, and that's important. Not just this pawn, but this square here. If the pawn were to take, you want to keep material intact here. Bishop to a4, pinning down this knight to the king, and the king can't easily move away. The dark square bishop has not been developed in the game state. So this king here on e8 is probably going to be hanging out for a while. If queen to c7, trying to add protection to this knight, this is really just a game of building up threats around this pinned piece here on c6. Queen to f3, attacking that. Rook over here to c8. rook to b1, attacking the bishop. And both sides, if they wanted to, could just continue down this path. Bishop back here to a8. Still want to continue to defend this square here on c8, but does not want to be attacked by the rook. So bishop back here a8, maybe rook to d1, defending this d file and the knight as well. Bishop down here to c5, attacking the knight. At some point, there is going to be an attack from white. He can lead the charge, and after the exchange on the board, it's going to be very difficult for black to come out of this okay. If for some reason decided to take this rook or this knight, all of a sudden rook up here to b8, check, and after the king moves, then this rook is going to fall. There's just no great way for black to continue. Now, if we come back and say after pawn to a4, okay, well, what if we just see the knight take here on d4? Well, now we're going to see pawn to d4. And this no longer has an isolated pawn for white, which isn't too bad. There's still a backward pawn, which you can always threaten if you're black. So maybe this is something that black wants to try. And I think this is a pretty decent option. Now pawn to b4. Just trying to push a little bit further, making sure that it's more difficult for white to develop as much as he wants to, and keeping in mind that this allows him to put even more pressure on this backward pawn here on d4. So that's another option that he had. Chose not to do that. Instead went with the option of bishop down here to c5. Now this is attacking the knight on d4, but unfortunately after the exchange, black's going to be on the short end of the sticks. Pawn takes on b5, pawn takes, rook takes here on a8, bishop takes here on a8, and then knight to b5. And this is where we talked about earlier, the knight and the pawn were both attacking the square here on b5. This bishop coming down to c5 is a good development move, but it was doing nothing to aid the exchange that was happening on this queen side of the board. So all of a sudden we have an exchange that has occurred, and white is now up a pawn here. It's a pass pawn, can eventually push this forward, and at the end of the day, you know, I think white's going to end up being pretty good in this position. So after the rook or castle on the king side, then we see the queens come off the board, bishop over here to f4. So white says, I have the advantage. Now let's go ahead and trade off material. Let's get the queens off the board. Don't want to have to worry about that. Let's simplify the game as much as possible. In the end game, does seem like white's going to be able to push this, but it's not easy. You know, if you can just sit here and figure out a very brute force tactic to push this pawn forward, it's very, very difficult. It's going to be a long, tedious win if Alexander Grischuk wants to go ahead and grind this out to the very, very end. So we continue with pawn to h6. Wants to make sure there's no back rank mate with the rook ever coming to this 8th rank here, and the king can't move. So pawn to h6 also stops any threat of bishop to g5 at some point. Pawn to h4, knight back here to e7, and then rook to d1. Says, hey, if you want to exchange the rooks off the board, that is completely fine with me. Kramnik recognizing he needs to have some material on the board if he wants to overcome this pawn deficit, and plays rook over here to b8, attacking the knight here on b5. Now bishop to c4, defending the knight. Bishop down to c6, attacking the knight. Knight just decides to move over here to d4. Bishop to e4, pawn up to h5, knight down here to d5. So blocking the center of the board. Black does have control of that, stopping this pawn from pushing forward anymore. White's just going to have to maneuver his pieces around. He has a king here on g1. Will eventually want to activate this. Same as black. Wants to get his king involved into the action, start some sort of attack, and try to gain some momentum, because right now it's just a plan of, can white push his pawn up the board? We see an exchange, the bishop takes and the bishop recaptures. So black does have the bishop pair. It's not completely an open board state, and right now most of the action's on one side of the board. Bishop pairs really do better if there's two pawn structures on either side of the board. Bishop down to e3, rook over here to c8, rook to e1. And then we see a lot of maneuvering from both sides. Bishop to c4, knight f3, bishop to a3. And you'll see a couple things. One is black is going to really spend a lot of its time maneuvering these three pieces, and that is pretty much it. And white is going to do very similar tactics, but he's also going to be pushing up his pawns and getting his king involved into the action. So bishop to d4, this is a great outpost. It's defending both of these pawns on the board, and the pawn is protecting the bishop as well. Knight down here to d2. Bishop to b2, and this is interesting because both the bishop and the rook here are both attacking the pawn. So if the bishop were to take here, then the rook could just come down and capture if the bishop takes. And we see knight to f1. It's always interesting when you see this because your immediate thought is, okay, well, two pieces here attacking this. This is going to be very good for black, but it's actually more protected than black would like, because if the bishop were to take here, then rook over here to c1. This bishop is being pinned down. If the bishop takes, then the rook is going to fall. That's going to be extremely bad for black. If we see some other, combination, just doesn't really matter how it could continue. Bishop here takes on f1. Sure, king takes. But at the end of the day, there's no way to stop this. The bishop could take here on c3, or black's just going to lose material from any other variation. So instead, we see the rook come down here to c4, rook here to e3, bishop to f5, knight g3 attacking the bishop. Bishop swings back to h7. King to h2, taking the long approach. Bishop here to c1, attacking the rook. Rook e2. And then you see the king start to move around the board. Slow and steady, but that is completely okay with Alexander Grischuk. He does have time. King here to e3. Bishop back here, c2. And then all of a sudden, king to d2. And it's marched the long way. Many, many moves instead of just coming this way. But he recognized this was the safest way to go about it, and now he can start to aid this pawn with his king if he wants to at some point. Bishop here to b3, rook to b1, attacking both the bishops. Rook pretty much has to come down here to a2. King to d3, bishop to a4. Now the knight's going to start to get involved. Knight to e4, very central square. This knight has a lot of options of how he wants to continue. King to e3, bishop to c2, rook here e1. Bishop b3, pawn here to a g4. And many of these moves, they are kind of going through a similar motion. Sometimes they're even twofold repetition. Don't want to get to threefold from white's point of view, because it would be a draw. And if you're not familiar with threefold repetition, the board state is the same in multiple positions. If he does that 3 times, it would be a draw in the game. But both of these players recognizing that it's just all about this pawn here on c3 right now. Black is not even spending time trying to push forward with his pawns. He's just trying to play defense over here because he realizes that if for some reason one of these pawns pushes past and he has to worry about 2 threats on both sides of the board, it would be overwhelming. So white can just very slowly and methodically push up the board on the king side while getting his king involved, and then only when the time is right, start pushing forward with his pawn here on c3. Now bishop to d5, king here to d3, centralizing. Bishop e7, rook to b1, rook up here to a8, and then pawn to f4, just continuing the push here. Bishop to h4, rook to h1, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes back here to d8, rook here to b1, bishop to c7, king e3, king h7, knight up to d6. So still not very clear when white's able to start pushing forward. Black seems to be doing a very good job of protecting any pushing from white's point of view. But knight to d6, finally getting that knight more involved into the game. King to g8, rook up here to b5, so getting aggressive with the rook. Bishop to c6, rook back here to b4, a bishop to a d8, and it says, hey, let's go and exchange material off the board, recognizing that's not the path to victory for black. Decides to play bishop here to h4, bishop to a d4, bishop down here to a g2. Could have also tried bishop back here, to d8. There's just so many different options. Many of them are the same from both sides. But bishop down here to g2, rook down to b2, attacking the bishop. And we see very similar twofold repetition. Then after bishop to c6, not wanting to draw the game, now plays rook to b3. So it is a little bit different, but both sides not doing too much differently in the game. Bishop to g3, and at this point, and only this point, after close to 50 moves now, we see the pawn push forward to c4. It's about time. It's happening. It's happening. It has moved. We have all waited for the moment, and it has finally moved. Pawn to c4. And we continue. Bishop back here to h2. Pawn pushing forward, f5. And after the exchange here on f5 with the knight, king here to h7. Bishop back here to b2, and then rook to e8. So there's now a double attack on this isolated pawn. Both the bishop and the rook attacking it. Only does have this one defender with the bishop here on b2. But that's okay. Very similar to as we've seen throughout. Alexander Grischuk is prepared for these when it seems like both the bishop and the rook are attacking a piece. All of a sudden, he plays something like knight to d6 and pretty much stops that attack. So there's no way that the rook's going to come down and take first, because he would lose that exchange. And if the bishop takes, well then just the rook is going to fall right here. So that's going to be bad. So he has to play rook here to e7. White plays rook up here to b8. I'm really expecting this position. Bishop takes, bishop recaptures, rook down here to e5, check. Yes, the king can come to d4, attacking the rook, and now adding an extra layer of security so this pawn can start pushing forward here. But it does equalize the material, and black does have the light square bishop. This does defend the square here on c8, which the pawn would promote to. So I feel like he has a fighting chance here. That's not the option he chose to. Instead, decided to play pawn here to f6. Rook here to c8, and then bishop back here at h1. This is a really questionable move to me. This bishop here on h2 is a great piece. It's attacking both of these pawns. This pawn can't take here on f6, which white would really like to do, because then the knight falls. Okay, well, that's bad. It's also just adding another layer of protection here. White has to worry about the fact that both now the pawn, the rook, and the bishop are all attacking here. The bishop could easily just come to d7, still stopping any sort of threat from the pawn pushing forward, still stopping an attack here if the pawn were to push to c8, also just forcing this rook to move. But instead it comes back here to h1, not very involved into the action. Yes, it is protecting these light squares, not attacking any material though. Just feel like there is a better option here. Knight to f5, rook check. Rook comes over here to b7, and then pawn takes here on f6. And this is pretty underwhelming. I didn't want to see the pawn take. Could easily just push forward with e6. Look at how much more dangerous this looks. Just not worried about material right here. He wants more threats. And this pawn, this passed pawn here on e6 can start pushing forward. Just had so much threat to his attack. The knight here on f5 has a great outpost. As it pushes forward, it's being protected by the knight. Very easy for white to continue in this position. But that's not what he did. He played the pawn takes here on f6. And then rook down to b3. In this position, white played probably the move of the game so far, maybe even the tournament so far. But take a minute, pause, see if you can find the best move for white to continue. And the move is bishop to c3. And we'll kind of dive into why this was such a good move. If we were to see something like the rook take on c3, giving up that material, then all of a sudden king to d4. This activates the king. It's attacking the rook. The rook is going to be forced to move here. So let's just say the rook comes back to b3. Okay, no harm, no foul. Let's just go back to the square the rook was at. What is now up that bishop in material, but now pawn to f7. And you can see how big of a threat this is. And there's no great way to stop this. If the bishop can't come here to d6 because the knight is attacking that. So how does black continue? Maybe bishop down here to g1 check, but then king to e5. Just adding to the fact that can start to come up the board and defend that pawn. Bishop to h2 check. Okay, king to e6, and there's no way to really stop this threat. Now in the game, unfortunately, black recognized this and saw, man, this is a fantastic move, and it stops the check here. and there's no way I can take this and it's going to be good. And so black decides to go ahead and take this pawn here on f6, which is really the move that he had to make, because we kind of looked at just taking that bishop is not going to be what he wants to do here. King here to d2, and this does open up the door for the bishop to take here on f6. Also just starts to get this king over to the queen side of the board for protection. Bishop to f4, great. King here to c2, attacking the rook. And then the rook takes. We do see the bishop take here on b8. Knight up here to e8. Bishop to e4. King to d2. And so now the king can easily just maneuver as it needs to. White is up material. He does have this pass pawn on the c file. And without the rooks on the board, now it's just a matter of in-game execution that he can go through and get the victory. And it was interesting as we were watching this, both players had around a minute left. And the timer kept going to 0 for both players. Even White, and we're like, well, this just doesn't make sense because White's clearly winning here. There's no way he's going to let the time bank run out. And from Black's perspective, we just kept waiting for Vladimir Kramnik to resign, and he never resigned. Now, out of all the players in the field, he is going to go the distance as long as possible. I think over half of his games have gone like something 60-something moves plus, which many of the other players, they're like 20, 30, sometimes 40 moves. Vladimir Kramnik likes to play the in-game, sort of that Magnus Carlsen, where I'm just going to try to grind my opponent mentally. I feel like that usually only works if you're playing the same opponent for like an entire series, like the World Championship. If you're grinding down one opponent and you're also physically draining yourself, but you're clearly losing and you're going to lose, you might as well just resign. Get your mind right, prepared for the next game. No reason to spend 8 hours on a game knowing that you're going to lose. Just take the L and move on. But we don't see that. We see Vladimir Kramnik fighting even in a losing position. King here to f3, king back to f7. Bishop to f4. This is where I thought Black would resign. You know, this stops pretty much all the threats, but we do not see a resignation. Bishop to d4, king e7, pawn up here to c7, king here to d7, h7, king c8, king e2, king d7, and then only after king to d3, after 91 moves, Vladimir Kramnik decides, okay, I've had enough. I will resign in this position. Not sure why he couldn't do that 20 moves earlier, but that's okay. Congratulations to Alexander Grischuk. Great game from him. Knowing that he lost to this opponent in round 1, now he has some redemption playing with the white pieces, and he's only a point back of the leader, and he still gets to face Fabiano. If he can beat Fabiano, then he's now tied with him. So we do have 6 rounds left, so a lot of chess to be played, but Fabiano Caruana is half a point ahead of the rest of the field, and Grischuk is now only a point behind the leader. So thank you guys for watching. This has been the longest game we have a record as far as moves in a long time. So thank you for sticking with me for those that did, and I'll see you guys in the next video.